Welcome to Full PreFrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive function. This podcast is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. So join us as we explore executive function and the science of learning. And now, here's your host, the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.
Hello, welcome to Full PreFrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. Thank you once again for joining me. I am delighted to continue these conversations about learning, education, thinking, developing the whole mind, and becoming those individuals who contribute to our society in the most effective ways. And of course, our prefrontal cortex, we should pray and hope is the reliable and trustworthy assistant who stays with us throughout this journey. As I was getting ready for this interview, I have a very special person for you to listen to. I was taken back to the history of the Committee of 10. Many of you might know this is kind of the birth of education. So the National Association of United States, and I'm now quoting Wikipedia, Committee on Secondary Studies, known as the NEA Committee of 10, was a working group of educators that convened in 1982, and they were tasked to kind of set the standards or practices. And interestingly, there were things like people like Henry King, James Baker, James McKenzie, and many people who contribute to the way we envisioned, education. But I think as we rethink education, the real question is who shapes the decisions about educating the future generation. And it's a great pleasure because we have a guru himself who has given a lot of thought about, and we have come a long way since that Committee of 10, whatever they conceptualized, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But today I have with me Dr. Tony Wagner. He's a globally recognized voice in education. He currently serves as a senior research fellow at the Learning Policy Institute, founded by Linda Darling Hammond in 2015. Prior to this appointment, Tony held a variety of positions at Harvard University for more than 20 years, including 4 years as an expert in residence at the Harvard Innovation Lab, and the founder and co-director for more than a decade of the Change Leadership Group at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He has incredible, rich knowledge and experience that he brings to the table because he has played many roles and worn many hats, including a high school teacher, K-8 principal, university professor, founding executive director of Educators for Social Responsibilities. But one thing that he's very often known for is his writing. And so at heart, I would say he's a writer, and he has written multiple books. Two main ones that have had very influential impact on my thoughts about education, one being The Global Achievement Gap, and the second being Creative Innovators. But today, it's a delight to have him because he just published his memoir, which is called The Learning by Heart, an Unconventional Education. So with all this big introduction, welcome, Tony. Welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thank you, Sucheta. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm great to just have a conversation with you.
So since we talk about executive function, as executive function skills refer to this set of mental skills, using these skills, we manage our thoughts, manage our emotions, manage our actions, so that we are effective in achieving the goals that we have set for ourselves. The main caveat there is by self, for self, and in an enlightened self-interest way, not in a selfish way. And that discernment, of course, is also an evolution of that brain that allows you to regulate your thoughts and behaviors. When I read your memoir, one of the striking things, and forgive me if I'm being bold here, but you would have been a kid who would have been referred to my practice. And it's I say that with endearment because, one, I think those who are interested in educating children and those children who are unwilling participants of that education become the troublemakers. And so you were a troublemaker. And here you are, multiple years later, decades later, highly accomplished. So tell us a little bit about your suffering as a child and why were you so difficult?
Well, I think in another way, I still am a troublemaker. At least I hope I am. I'm trying to provoke very different conversations about education. But, there were problems with school for me. There was so much emphasis on rote memorization and obeying authority. And I didn't see the point in either, to be quite honest. I didn't have a huge amount of respect for the authorities around me because, I had big questions. I was very curious. I wanted to understand the world and why people were doing crazy things. I wanted to understand racism and so on. And school wasn't about any of those big, important questions. School didn't help me make meaning of the world. It gave me facts to digest. And so from a very early age, I just decided, I love learning. I just didn't like school. So I read, all kinds of books and learned about other things in other ways. But school was not something, that agreed with me. Let's put it that way. And as you know from the story, I left high school my senior year. Finally graduating from one of these last chance high schools. And then dropped out of college, not once, but twice. But I like to think of at least the second reason for dropping out as being a worthwhile one, because I became, as you know, very involved in the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement, which had a profound influence on my development and evolution as a young adult.
Yeah, and I think what I like about that is people should really do some, I love, you begin by talking about your own father who wrote his, I wouldn't say memoir, but he documented some of his memories from serving in World War II. And that was the first time you made some discoveries about his life experiences, which he never talked to you directly. And I think, I've been very fortunate to have my mom who lives with me and has been living with me off and on for last 13 years since my dad passed away. But I have had a lot of chance to talk with her about her journey as a child and her education and some of the things I never first was attuned to it, not interested in it, but I also I had an assumption that it must have been great. Because she looked fine.
Yeah.
So one thing I want to kind of, if you don't mind me indulging there, but one of the guests on my podcast has been a clinical psychologist, and Ross Green, and he says behaviorally challenging kids are challenging because they're lacking the skills to not be challenging. And so I think I was just curious. You had so many experiences of being misunderstood. And you then that rubbed against your own stubbornness, and it created a lot of conflict in your educational experience. It was obviously not seamless. But what you did have is incredible intellect and curiosity and the kahunas, if I may say so, to defy authority and get away with it a little bit. In the process, I think what was not visible to people is your inner angst. Yeah. And I think if we can spend a minute here, and there's so many kids I work with where they don't have either the tenacity like you did, or they don't have the enriched environment like you did, where there are books available, they could do the time travel through their mind, or they have this opportunity to just wander. Your father had a great farm. So can you tell us two things? One is this being difficult and what it did to your psyche as a learner, how demoralizing that was. But secondly, what do we do about those kids who are not fortunate like you to have access in spite of school being so difficult?
Yeah. Well, it was profoundly demoralizing to me because I felt there was really something the matter with me. In retrospect, I have a somewhat different interpretation. But back at the time, I thought, why can't I be normal? Why can't I just sit down and do the darn homework and study for the tests and do what I'm told? and my parents just grew increasingly frustrated with me through the years. And finally, I think by the time I was 18 or 19, I guess 19 or 20 and dropped out of the second college, I think they'd just given up on me, really. And I don't blame them because they thought, we put all this time and effort into this kid and he's just a screw up. Even my teachers called me a screw up, and they didn't use the screw up word. They used a worse word beginning with F. And so I believed it. I thought, when one teacher said to me, Wagner, you're an F up. You've always been an F up. You're always going to be an F up. I took it as a life sentence. I said, okay, this is really who I am. And it took me many years of kind of building a life on my terms to come to understand that I wasn't. And, I know Russ well, and he and I have had some conversations.
Okay.
Yeah. At one point, he actually rented our downstairs apartment from us in Cambridge. So
my goodness.
We go way back. But, school has only one narrow path for kids. It is very prescriptive. It says, these are the skills that count. This is the knowledge that counts. Your questions, they don't count. We don't have time for those. Your curiosity, no, I'm sorry. No time for that. So, I think when we think about what's up with kids who have problems within school, we have to also understand that, school is a kind of one-size-fits-all factory assembly line model. And if the size doesn't fit you, you're labeled an outlier or a screw up or worse. And so I think in answer to your second question, one thing we really need to understand is that kids learn in different ways, have all kinds of skills and dispositions. And, I've been reading Angela Duckworth's book, Grit, which I highly recommend. And I'm sure you know it quite well.
Yes, love that.
She said passion and perseverance are what truly matters. And if you don't build an education system around helping young people to find and pursue their passion, they're never going to develop perseverance. So in time, I did find and develop my passion, which enabled me to develop my perseverance, my grit, my tenacity.
Yeah, and I think that made me really sad. Like so many of your teachers repeatedly, your failure to complete work, failure to cooperate, failure to just not behave or be respectfully engaged in compliance. Compliance is what they were asking
Exactly
for.
Right. Yes.
And that you were not disrespectful, but you were just not showing respect through compliance. And I see that as a fundamental barrier to so many children's education. Yeah. And if they have a question, that's squashed. And I'm not blaming educators. I think there's something wrong with the way we have structured the learning experience. Yeah. So that's a problem. But the second point I wanted to also kind of talk about is the issue of boredom. So I have had a neuroscientist who studies boredom, and he and his colleague wrote a book on Out of My Skull. And he quotes, a key precondition for flow is a balance between what the moment demands of us and our ability to skillfully meet those demands. So you talk a lot about being bored. And so I had a question for you as you look back. So I see that as a Goldilocks effect. Either the challenging is too challenging or the challenge is not challenging enough. And the sweet spot cannot be average, like the gifted classroom. The teacher is teaching to the 27th percentile of the classroom, right? So how do we, so you navigated that by doing some, inner discovery, but what do you suggest? What should kids do when they're facing this incredible doldrum of education that doesn't make sense, but somehow systems are not changing fast enough and they're required to participate?
Yeah. I think the long-term answer is developing an education system that is tailored to the individual instead of trying to tailor the individual to the education system.
Amen.
But I didn't understand that until I'd read Summerhill by A.S. Neal when I was 18. Yeah. But what can children do themselves? I think relatively little. I think without supportive adults, children are left to conclude that there's something the matter with them because they don't fit. But I think with supportive adults, and I, as you know, interviewed a number of young adults who were themselves highly creative and didn't necessarily fit school, but had supportive parents and other teachers around them who encouraged them outside of school to explore their interests, to develop and pursue passions. And so I think that's the short answer, is that finding and developing real interests, taking a child's curiosity seriously, taking their questions seriously, whatever they may seem, is in a way the stopgap solution to schooling that doesn't take children's interests seriously. If you have parents and other adults around you, and as you know, I found several actually in a summer camp, because there weren't any other adults immediately around me who were giving me that support. I just kind of stumbled forward, kind of blindly, continuing to read novels because I loved reading good literature for some reason, crazy reason.
It's so sweet. I think as you talk about the influences of all these adults that came into your life, it's a really like a Nancy Drew moment, to see a little discovery that a little boy is making as he's watching quiet people with incredible skill, or some charismatic adult. And I just took me back to this reference of Julius Siegel, who coined the term charismatic adult, a person with whom children identify and from whom they gather strength. And I find that in a lot of your childhood experiences and many of mine, there are not many adults keenly interested in making observations or connecting to that child's inner well-being. And I think there's some confusion about being nice to children versus really caring. And I love the concept of this strong but firm presence, right, in child's life. And I think, so I'm almost tempted to write an article, How to Love Children.
Yeah.
I feel there is a genuine missing ingredient that we should make a prerequisite, is those who are in education should know how to love children. And I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts about the way we do teacher preparation? We don't enough emphasize on love.
Well, love in our culture is loaded, isn't it? Is it erotic love?
Expectations.
Is it, what kind of love is it? Is it indulgent love? Is it erotic love? So I think that's particularly challenging. I would frame the challenge perhaps a little bit differently for teachers. I think it's listening to children, all children, not just the ones who are vocal, but maybe even especially trying to draw out the quiet children, listening, attending to them. And that's, of course, a part of love, being attentive. Erich Fromm wrote this classic tome that had a profound influence on me back in the early 60s called The Art of Loving. And he said, love is care, respect, knowledge, and understanding. I think if you translate that into teacher preparation, then, you really say we need to treat each child as an individual. Now, the problem, of course, is that that's not what our society wants our teachers to do. They want our teachers to get every kid to score highly on a variety of tests, tests which tell us absolutely nothing about work, learning, or citizenship readiness in the 21st century. So there's right now a severe mismatch between what the education system is producing and what the education system is telling teachers it wants for outcomes versus what's required to live a fulfilled life, to thrive as a child and as an adult. So I think it's that mismatch that we really need to attend to.
Yeah, I guess I think I agree with you. I think I would replace love. What I meant by love was the positive regard,
yes,
which is unconditional acceptance of the way the child is of today.
Yes.
But having incredible faith, the future is not the same and rigid. So it brings me back to this idea of executive function of the teacher really matters. The way they harboring growth mindset, their own attitudes and belief systems, and the way they view their job. Is my job to get through this curriculum and test, or is that my job to transform a child?
Yes.
And you did have some interesting and amazing educators who did that for you. Do you mind sharing with us those who really made an impact?
Oh, there were a number. Only one of whom was actually a teacher in my school. So first of all, I was sent to a summer camp for 5 years, a boys' camp on a lake in New England. And I had a couple of profound experiences there. One is I was befriended by another camper who was the son of a Cherokee Indian chief who was also there. So Jimmy and I became fast friends, and he invited me to join his father and a couple of other campers to work on learning Indian dances and folklore, American Indian dances and folklore. He was Cherokee, the Cherokee chief and artist by the name of Wampanoag. You can find out about him. He was quite famous. So I spent an entire summer being a student of Wampanoag's. And it was we were making our own costumes. We were learning and practicing dances every single day. But he was also quietly teaching me about a very different way of understanding the world, about the Cherokee religion, which is kind of nature-based. And at the time, I had a profound kind of connection to nature, which I still have. I live on a lake right now. So that was the beginning of a different understanding of the world, if you will. And I was a clumsy kid, but with Jimmy's help and his dad's teaching, I ended up being able to do this dance in front of the whole camp. And then the other experience at camp was studying axemanship with this 75-year-old man.
I love that story.
And it's really, again, almost mystical, what you might think of happened. At this camp, you had to earn ribbons to kind of become a more senior camper. Think of them as just like merit badges in scouting. Yes. And there were all kinds of ribbons offered. But for some crazy reason, I decided I wanted to earn my ribbon in axemanship, which existed as a possibility on paper, but nobody asked for it. So Colonel Elwell was his name. And I spent 2 summers studying with him. First, he taught me how to sharpen an axe every day, because a dull axe is the thing that will kick back and cut you. Then he taught me how to carry an axe properly through the woods. Then he taught me the different kinds of trees, but most importantly, how to fell a tree, how to figure out where it's going to go. And then, of course, I had to cut the tree up. I had to chop it into wood that could be used, and I had to cut a certain amount of wood to earn my ribbon. So it went on and on. But what was so interesting was, all right, so my tree got hung up. It didn't fall down. I wasn't graded on a bell curve. That wasn't a test that I failed or got a C- on. It was learning through trial and error. He would simply say, okay, what did you learn from that? What are you going to do differently next time? It was, in other words, a mastery-based curriculum, if you will, a proficiency-based, competency-based. It was, complete or not. You got the ribbon when you met the standard or you didn't. And that profoundly influenced my thinking as an adult educator years later, and still does to this day. And then, of course, there was my teacher in high school. It was the best of times and the worst of times with 2 high school English teachers
Charles
I
Dickens,
had.
yes.
And the one I mentioned already used the F word on me, and I left that school the next morning. Wagner, you're an F up. And so I was just so profoundly humiliated and demoralized. So at this very last chance school, for some reason, I really decided I wanted to pursue writing. I'd been very interested in writing for 2-3 years, but I really kind of started working at it. And I approached not my English teacher, who was not particularly sympathetic, but another teacher in the school. And I said, would you teach me to write? His name was Mr. Edmonds. And his reply was, I'd be delighted. He was an Englishman, very, very warm and gentle. So we would meet every week for a tutorial. And every week he would give me a different kind of writing to try. A monologue, a dialogue, a childhood reminiscence, a critical review. And every week he'd sit down and read what I had written the previous week. And he would comment on one or two things that he thought I'd done with some skill, had done well. And then he would make a couple of suggestions. Didn't use a red pen. Wasn't a long list of things that I'd done wrong. But, I grew and I developed. He was nurturing my passion, which hardened into perseverance. And, I'm about to start an 8th book. And I often wonder, had it not been for him, would I have gone down that path? I don't know.
It's such a lovely story. And I think you're absolutely lucky to have this opportunity to go to a summer camp, and I'm so happy you did, because you had some experience of heaven in your childhood as learning heaven, which school wasn't. And, it just reminded me so many parallels. I grew up in India and we didn't have the concept of summer camps. But, I remember my father. So we would go to the market every other day to get fresh vegetables. And one of the things was to know the quality of vegetable based on the way it feels and the way it looks and the way it's stacked. And so my father he and I would just walk through the market, and he would ask me, which vendor should we go to? How has he arranged his vegetables? And then when we pick the mangoes, for example, he would test and ask, how many days do you think it's going to take for these mangoes to be ripe? And then he would just let you experiment, and then we would test it. And I said 3 days. And then 3 days he would say, did the mangoes ripe? And he said, oh, no, it's not. Then next time when we would go, we would do the same thing again. So other tradition we had in the house is to determine the taste or flavor of food without tasting it. So very young age, my father was sick with jaundice, and he was hospitalized for one month. And so I had to take up cooking. I was just 12, I think. And my brothers, who were even worse than I was, so I made so many rotis, bread, that was dog food.
No.
But I think that experiential learning is an invaluable aspect of growing your sense of self, your efficacy, and your understanding of your skill mastery that requires motor planning, right? Yeah. Because a lot of concepts in schooling are abstract. But if you don't have concrete parts associated with learning, so it just took me back to my summer camp was shopping
but that's
in the
wonderful.
marketplace.
But in a way, it's similar. I think most important learning is trial and error. And he let you have trials and errors and learn from them. We don't do that in school. We penalize errors. We don't.
Yes, we do.
And the more errors you make, the lower you are perceived to be on the bell curve, the dumber you're supposed to be. And so we have it all backwards in school. How do you learn to ride a bike? How do you learn to talk or walk or shop in the market? Trial and error. And sensory observation is an essential element of that. But of course, we don't include that in school either.
So, a lot of your examples, amazing examples, and people that you talked about who started these amazing, innovative schools, and we're talking about not in like late 90s or early 21st century. These people have been at it since like 1930s and 40s.
Yeah.
And it's just a sample. It's just an example. Why? So I know I'm kind of switching gear a little bit, but what do you think about the current condition of the way we educate children? I mean, there was a buzz happening around 21st century readiness when it was 1999. I remember it became a huge debate and kaput, 20 years down the road, I'm not seeing any change. All these amazing ideas that you talk about and so many people talk about in my own, work that I'm talking about teaching executive function as a subject, not teach how to learn as a subject, since you're not teaching it through your teachings. And so I know you're talking a lot about changes that need to happen globally, but do you mind talking a little bit about has it happened and what seem to be the barriers?
Yeah. Well, that's a key question. I think, first of all, we have to understand that education by and large is adapted to our economy.
Yes.
And so we created the assembly line model of education, as you described it, in 1892 to fit the industrial model. Now, the problem is we no longer have, a primarily an industrial education, an industrial economy. We don't make very many things anymore. We don't even have what's called a knowledge economy. Peter Drucker coined that term 50 years ago. Knowledge today is a mere commodity. What we have is an innovation economy, and our education system has not kept pace. Now, I think one simple way to understand that is because we teachers teach in the ways that we've been taught ourselves, or a few of us are driven to experiment. Later on in the book, I described 10 years of effort to try to become the teacher I wished I'd had as a student. We parents want schools to look like the ones they went to or ones they wished they had gone to. So we are lacking what I would call an R&D capability in education, a research and development capability. Periodically we've had amazing innovators in education: Maria Montessori, John Dewey, Ted Sizer, Deborah Meyer, and many, many others whose shoulders I stand on. But they've been the exception. We need an R&D capability, first of all, in every school of education. John Dewey created the lab school at the University of Chicago, but it didn't last after he left. It's not there anymore. No schools of education have their own laboratory schools. No school districts have lab schools. Charter schools have the capability of being laboratories of innovation, a few of them, but now we've pitted charter schools against conventional public schools in a fight for scarce resources, so they can't learn from one another. So we need, first and foremost, an R&D capability. Second of all, we need a leadership voice. And I'm talking about business leaders and civic leaders who say, we are not preparing kids for work, learning, or citizenship in the 21st century. That in the 21st century, all kids need new skills, not some kids, all kids. Exactly. And merely aspiring to bring our most disadvantaged kids up to the levels of our middle-class kids is in effect going to sentence all of our kids to being left behind because they're getting a mediocre education for another era. And we're frankly really going to be further and further behind. And I think a direct impact is the kind of spiraling loss of citizenship proficiency that we see in this country.
That's so well said, that education is an economy. And I think we should not forget that. I think we have all these high motto aspirational things we say about education, but ultimately it comes down to funding. And I really love this point. And if I may bring attention to it, is I think distinction between disadvantaged children versus disabled children or children with disabilities. I think children who come from poverty and people with children with disadvantages are treated worse than children with disability. But even children with disability are also not given the opportunity to conquer. Like you, as I mentioned, you would be a child with disability in 21st century because we would say you're not paying attention, you're not complying, you're not cooperating, you're going on your own.
I'm sure I would have been sentenced to special ed classes and never recovered.
And yes, and they would have actually accused you for not being smart. So that's another issue. But, I do want to kind of take a pause here and weave in the issues of poverty, equity, and the racial divide. America is struggling with equity. There was a report that came out in 2019 by Ed Builder that showed that majority white districts receive $23 billion more than majority non-white districts. This is glaring in our face. And then we have no support system, and we still actually harbor a lot of beliefs about children who are non-whites and their capabilities.
Yes.
What are you thinking about this, and who is at the helm of the change? There are lots of thinkers who are making recommendations, but I just don't see them getting enacted fast enough or at the larger scale or for deserving kids.
Yeah. I mean, I just couldn't agree more. It's glaringly clear that rich families send their kids to rich schools and poor families have no recourse but to send their kids to poor schools. And the resource differential is just appalling and I think just unforgivable. So obviously we need to make our education funding not just level, but actually more resources to the more disadvantaged, because we know that if they have an extended school day that's enrichment, if they have summer programs, if they have a quality preschool program, they will excel. The research is overwhelmingly clear, and I know you know it. It's not as if they're, mentally disabled. Disadvantaged simply means they have not had the advantages of well-to-do white kids. And so if we give them some kinds of compensatory opportunities, they will thrive. But then here comes the next point, which is let's take away the time factor in school.
Yes.
In the adult world, to be a plumber, a pilot, a physician, you work to a level of competence or proficiency.
Yes.
Without a stopwatch on you. How many times do you take a driver's test? Well, some pass it on the first time, some take 15 tries. Who cares? Who remembers? All that matters is that somebody is a proficient driver. School should be exactly the same. A high school diploma right now today, as like a college diploma, is a certificate of seat time served. What is a Carnegie unit? We talk about courses as having X numbers of Carnegie units. It's a certificate of seat time served. A high school diploma and a college diploma should be a certificate of mastery, a certificate of proficiency, required merit badges along with optional merit badges. But it gets back to the problem, to answer your question, why isn't this happening? Because we're not an evidence-based or research-based policy environment for education, health, or sometimes in health, but so often not at all in education. There is a huge body of evidence about what works and what doesn't that we systematically ignore. And some of it's money, some of it's just posturing. It's a lot of things. You look at a country like Finland, which has taken all this evidence seriously for 40 years and has the best education system in the world, no question. And, when the Finns ask, well, what did they do? They said, well, we read the research that Americans had done and we paid attention to it. Well, we don't do that here.
Yeah, and I think that was funny that so many people are benefiting from the ideas, the right ideas and ripe ideas. I feel like it's become like the social media posting, like it's somebody posting an inspirational quote, but never living in that inspired way. Yeah. I feel what's the point of posting? But that brings me to the next, and you kind of lovely ways you brought this up, but this idea of a play, while talking about the concept of free play, psychologist Peter Gray describes free play as activity that is freely chosen and directed by the participants and undertaken for its own sake. And then you juxtapose baby Einstein, sending your children to these camps where you learn to hit the ball. I mean, there's no discovery left. Even like you will probably cry if you heard the way kids are doing summer camp these days. Mm-hmm. They have scheduled activities and no exploration in it. So I think, what are your thoughts? You talk a lot about play and you talk about this idea of innovation that comes from that exploration, but we don't have that enough opportunities to do that.
You're absolutely right. I researched and wrote a book called Creating Innovators, which you referred to earlier.
I love that book, by the way.
Thank you. I had a lot of fun. I learned a lot writing it, and I had a lot of fun. Unlike my previous book where I had interviewed business leaders, this one I interviewed young people in their 20s, all of whom were already recognized as remarkable creative problem solvers, innovators, in other words. And I tried to understand what had made the difference in their lives, and come to find out there were some practices that both parents and teachers had pursued. The parents encouraged much more exploratory play, get outside, fewer toys, toys without batteries. They limited screen time. Teachers tried to create opportunities for kids to engage in a kind of serious play in school in terms of exploring interests and ideas. So as these kids grew older, their parents were very intentional about encouraging them to pursue interest in the hopes that they might develop a real passion. When we talk about grit, perseverance, tenacity, it does not come from a tiger mom sitting on your shoulders yelling at you to practice for 10,000 hours. It comes from an interest that grows into a passion that becomes, over time, a sense of purpose. And that's what Angela Duckworth writes so eloquently about, and it's what I discovered in my research. So that play is a vital element of learning. I mean, Alison Gopnik talks in her books about how infants play to make meaning of the world. Play is the work of children. It's not play. It's a wonderful paradox, right? Play is the work of children because that's how we learn. And even in the adult world, purposeful play, disciplined play is what scientists do. It's what artists do. It's what you and I do. It is still play because it is fulfilling our passion in a purposeful way with discipline. That's a kind of play. So we go from random play to more focused play to the development of passion to finally arriving at a sense of purpose. And in every case, I found that that's what these young innovators had done with help from teachers and parents along the way.
I think the beauty in that is, first of all, play is such a great source of joy. And there's also a source of relaxation. That means you're not actually highly stressed when you're not performing play, you're playing. And I think that it is the activating the default mode network. So a lot of creativity where you connect ideas that are loosely hanging around you can come into focus. What I find is incredible. Recently I watched, I have subscribed to Masterclass, and Wayne Gretzky, I do not care about ice hockey or have watched it, but I just love experts, just like you have studied them in business and as well as young youth. And he was so funny. He was talking about this story that in the summer, they lived in Canada and in Ottawa, I think, and they would have deep winters like in Boston. But in the summer, their lawn would be the greenest. And so all the neighbors would come and ask, what are you doing? What special treatment are you doing to your lawn? And turns out, he said, my father never let the secret out, because the secret was he had created an ice rink because he saw Wayne's interest and all his 3 children's interest in ice hockey. So he would just create a rink and he would pour water and keep putting water so it became ice. And because of this nourishment the land got the product was lawn, but it was lost on them, this effort and free play. And then Wayne Gretzky went on saying that I became good not because I wanted to become good, but when I hit the puck and it did not go into the net, the walk on that snow to get the puck back was so tedious. I said, I'm going to avoid that.
That's interesting.
So I think if you just unveil the little minds that children put when they're developing skills, there's so much joy. You're saying, how can I create a shortcut? That's your creative problem solving right there.
Exactly right.
Innovation at its best, right?
Yeah, right.
So you have also talked about, you talk very compassionately about the hope you have in your heart for education, in spite of all these conditions. And so I would love for you to talk, and there are several points of intersection that you see hope for us to change our ways. Mm-hmm. Can you share with us, and one being learning from failures. Mm-hmm. Can you share a little bit about why there's so much value in that? And why should we care about revisiting failures?
Yeah. Well, actually, I'd like to get the F word out of school and out of parents' vocabularies entirely.
I love that.
I prefer learning from trial and error, because that is the nature of innovation. Innovation means going from 1.0 to 2.0. How do you do that? Through iteration. Iteration is simply trial and error, reflecting on the error, as you did with the mango, with your father's help, right? No, it wasn't ready in 3 days. That's an error you made. Was it a failure? No. All right, blame the mango. The mango failed to ripen in the 3 days. But quite seriously, I think that book, that language is crippling because it labels children as, quote, failures, as opposed to saying all learning is iteration, is trial and error, reflecting on the error, learning from the error, and trying again. 1.0 to 2.0 to 3.0. So to me, it really is about changing the language of learning and getting the F word and the bell curve and the stopwatch out of the classroom entirely. What we know when you focus on the development of proficiencies and you have a highly adaptive, individualized curriculum, which is possible now with computers, just about every single person can get to proficiency, no matter what it is. It may take some much longer. So what? Who cares? As long as they get to proficient, right? So, and if kids today don't reach a certain milestone by the prescribed time, according to the stopwatch, they're labeled failures or stupid.
Yes.
Same kind of failure, right? So I think the hope is that we really learn something from the innovation era. In fact, the skills you need today for work, for learning, and for citizenship have converged. I think for the first time in human history, they are the same skills. And that's profoundly civilizing when you think that everyone needs to learn to think critically, to work collaboratively, to communicate effectively, and solve problems creatively, whether, you think of the citizenship domain or the economy. So to me, that there's hope in that. There's also hope in the kinds of experiments I see going on with increasing frequency on the margins in education. Back when I started, there were very, very few experiments of any kind. They were mostly random. I learned about them more through history than current events. But now we see more and more schools trying very different approaches and succeeding with all kinds of kids. So to me, that's another basis for hope.
I love that. And I love that going back to this idea about failure, one thing that I have believed, and I always bring that in my work, is when you define learning means not knowing. And when you're shifting from not knowing to knowing, error is inevitable.
Sure.
Because if you don't encounter error, which is not an error, it's continuing to not know. So it's not an error. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I like to define error.
Yeah.
Incomplete knowledge or knowledge in the progression of becoming knowledge.
Yes.
And I think we are underestimating the nature of learning. And, I have created a software, which is that individualized learning, as you're talking about. It's called EXQ. It is developing learning how to learn skills from 6th grade to 12th grade by evaluating 6 components of executive function and creating a year-long curriculum for every single child. So you can have mastery that is at 4 levels of competence, because the mastery comes from exercise-based practice, but deliberate practice. That means it changes based on your competence. Second is that error analysis. And one of the most effective ways to improve executive function is task analysis skills, the complexity of the task, scope of the task, parts of the task, so that you can create executionary path. And these are the skills we are not teaching. Like your not axe grinding, but your axery skills. We're actually walking you through the steps. My dad, and I have to tell you another fun story. When I was growing up, another fun summer thing we did, which probably would kill most of modern children, which was to watch. Do you know what papadum is?
No.
It's a delicacy, which is you make this flour, and then it's very tightly kneaded, and then you make tiny balls and you roll it out into a round paper thin, and it's wet. And then you lay your mom's sari on the rooftop, and you lay these things and you watch them dry and make sure that no crow eats it because you don't have summer camp. Yeah. So for years we would do this, and there was so much learning to be done, because if you peel the papadum too soon, too prematurely, when you go to fry them, they would be wet. And if they're wet, then they would be splash of oil. But you don't get to redo papadum until next year. So there's a 12-month gap in your learning proficiency development. So I really like this
stakes.
example. High stakes. I like this example because some learning just takes so long to correct the course. And I think we are not teaching that embedded in learning. So I really appreciate the way you think about removing the F word. So as we come to an end, one, I can't let you go without you talking about this, the culture, the academic climate and culture. You know, you talk a lot about this passivity, compliance, and teacher leading as an expert in front of the classroom. As we shift, how do we let the children know the climate has changed? What will be the signals that we can send to the children so they know it's okay to voice their confusion, their challenge the authority in a way? Do you see any signs?
Well, I do think that the more you have a culture of listening to young people, of respecting their voices in a school,
I love that,
asking their opinions, giving them regular opportunities to voice their perspective and point of view, and showing that you heard it and that at least some of it you can act on. You may not be able to do it all. I think that's the message to be sending young people today that's critical. I think over time, what we need to understand is that the real role of a teacher is neither to be, the sage on the stage, nor is it to be a mere facilitator, a word that a lot of people use. It's rather to be a performance coach, coaching students to higher performance standards. It's what we do in the athletic fields. It's what we do in the fine arts studio, in the auditoriums. It should be exactly the same in classes. And so in order to coach someone to a higher standard, you have to really know that individual. You have to know what motivates them. You have to know what their proficiencies are, what their lacks are, and what they need to get to the next level. So it's that more individualized approach that I think is needed. Now, let's be clear. Most teachers would love to do that, but our system doesn't allow it. We give teachers a load that's too overwhelming. In Finland, the average teacher is in front of students 600 hours a year, with class sizes around 20. In our country, the average teacher teaches 1,100 hours a year in front of kids, with class sizes closer to 30. And if you multiply that in a high school where you're teaching 5 classes, that's 150 kids a day you're seeing. How can you individualize learning for 150 kids? The answer is you can't. So we have to think structurally about very different approaches. And there are good examples of that. As you may know, we did this film called Most Likely to Succeed, where we spent a year filming in a school. Very, very different approach. And so there are good examples out there that people can learn about.
And it just takes time to change. It's like a cruise ship. You have to, have it pivot facing north. So as we come to a close, do you have recommendations for our readers, in addition to your multitude of books? What has influenced your thinking? What has changed? And what has gotten you so excited about the way you think about things?
Well, I've mentioned a couple of authors already, and I'll mention them again. Alison Gopnik's research on how infants learn. Scientist in the Crib is one. The Carpenter, and I can't remember the title, but they're easily found. She also does occasional articles for the Wall Street Journal. I think she's really helping people understand the nature of human beings' hunger to learn and to make sense of the world from a very young age. And then I think the work of Carol Dweck, and I also mentioned of Angela Duckworth, really helping us understand it's not about talent. It's more about grit and perseverance and growth mindset, as you mentioned earlier. So that these are the qualities that matter most that parents need to focus on. And so I think, thinking about parenthood, reading these authors may help a parent understand a very different role for parenting.
Well, thank you for your recommendations. Thank you for
Pleasure.
your time and this great conversation. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. Please keep in touch. Send us an email, subscribe to our newsletter, and definitely spread the word. Once again, thank you for joining us today at Full PreFrontal, Exposing the Mysteries of Executive Function. Take care.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Full PreFrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. To contact your host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive function, visit her website at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. That's www.exqinfiniteknowhow.com. Tune in next week for another informative episode of Full PreFrontal, hosted by the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.